Hi, I'm Robin Shooter, founder of Empower Total Health. I bet you've heard the saying, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Probably heard it a couple of thousand times actually. It's usually attributed to the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, who's often called the father of medicine. I wonder though, have you ever really thought about what that saying means? I read a couple of articles this week. It's what I do for fun. I know I should probably get out more often, but my idea of fun is reading medical journal articles. So there are a couple that I came across this week that really caused me to reflect a lot more deeply on that very well-worn adage of Hippocrates. The first of these papers was a report that was issued by the US Food and Drug Administration, known as the FDA. It was roughly the equivalent of the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or the TGA, here in Australia. And the report was called 22 Case Studies where phase 2 and phase 3 trials had divergent results. Now, as background to this, a phase 2 trial will typically test out a new drug that's never been on the market before, or alternatively, an old drug that was approved to treat another condition. The phase 2 trial will be done on that old drug on a new condition. And they're done on a couple of hundred human volunteers who usually have just that one target condition and nothing else going on for a short period of time. So, and the idea of phase 2 trial is you use a range of dosages of the drug, you're checking for toxicity, for short-term side effects, and you're measuring biomarkers, things like blood test results or blood pressure, to get some idea of whether the drug might have potential to treat the condition that you have in mind. If the results of the phase 2 trial are promising, then the sponsors of the medical product, so that would be the pharmaceutical company in the case of a drug, or a medical device company in the case of some kind of device like a stent, for instance, they will then organise a phase 3 trial. And a phase 3 trial typically involves giving the drug to between a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand people for a longer period of time than the phase 2 trials, and actually measuring clinical outcomes such as the survival of the patient, say if it's a cancer drug, or their likelihood of having a heart attack if it was a heart disease drug, or the complication rate, say if it's a diabetes drug. And the idea of a phase 3 trial is to detect whether the drug is actually going to have a meaningful impact on patients' lives, as opposed to just giving them better numbers like lower blood pressure readings or lower cholesterol levels. That said, the FDA, and the same is true for other regulatory agencies around the world, has a very long and I would say not very proud history of approving drugs that offer no meaningful benefit to patients. The latest big example in the US is the approval of Addyi, this so-called female Viagra, which in phase 3 clinical trials, the trials that were used to approve the drug, demonstrated this earth-shattering increase of between 0.5 and 1 satisfying sexual encounters per month. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination to try to figure out what a half a satisfying sexual encounter might look like. But and the women who this drug was trialled on were labelled with this hypoactive sexual desire disorder. Yeah, got that? It's basically a diagnosis invented by drug companies used to describe women who have reduced sexual fantasies and reduced desire for sexual activity. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking maybe they ought to talk to these women's partners and make things a bit more fun in the bedroom, and they might enjoy it more. Or alternatively, maybe these women have underlying health conditions that reduce their sex drive. Now, the trade-off for this stupendous increase of 0.5 to 1 satisfying sexual encounters per month was an increased risk of developing hypotension, or dangerously low blood pressure, which can lead to fainting, also dizziness, vertigo. And by the way, it wasn't because the sex was so good that the earth moved for them. These are actual drug side effects. These women also suffer central nervous system depression, which can make them sleepy during the day, nausea, fatigue, sleeplessness at night, anxiety, constipation, abdominal pain, rash, dry mouth, especially if they're consuming alcohol along with this drug, or they're using other commonly used drugs like certain types of blood pressure lowering drugs, antibiotics, fluconazole, which is commonly prescribed for thrush, or antiretroviral drugs. I don't know about you, I'm not very keen to try this drug given the risks and benefits. The FDA's approval rate for new drugs now stands at 89%. So this is new drugs, as in drugs that have never been released into the market. If you count multiple uses for the same drug, so frequently a pharmaceutical company will apply for their drug to be used for multiple conditions. So counting that, the approval rate actually stands at 96%. I mean, the FDA is effectively acting as a rubber stamp. If you come up with a new drug, they'll approve it. The report, this 22 case report that the FDA published, actually drew on cases that stretch back to 1999. And I was thinking as I read this that it's very likely that many of the drugs and devices that were actually knocked back, that were mentioned in the report, might actually have gained approval if they'd been submitted more recently under the FDA's much laxer criteria. So to summarise the report, in 14 out of the 22 cases, phase 3 studies found that the drug was not effective. So the phase 2 studies had indicated that it was, and then the larger phase 3 study found that it didn't actually work. In one case, the phase 3 trial uncovered major safety issues that the phase 2 trial had missed. And in 7 cases, the phase 3 trials found that the treatment was neither safe nor effective. The most shocking thing was that in 2 cases, the phase 3 studies showed that the experimental product actually increased the risk of the problem that the drug or device was meant to prevent. So in one of those, there was a stent, one of these little mesh devices that are popped inside the artery of a person who's had a heart attack or found to have blocked arteries. And obviously that's meant to hold the artery open so they don't have a heart attack or another heart attack or maybe a stroke. So in this particular case, the stent actually increased the risk of their arteries blocking up again, which could lead to a heart attack. And the other case was a drug that was intended to reduce heart attack risk by raising the level of HDL, the so-called good cholesterol. Instead, it did that very well, by the way. It did very successfully raise HDL quite significantly. The problem was that it raised the risk of suffering a major adverse cardiac event like a heart attack by 25%, and the risk of dying overall by 58%. So a nearly 60% greater risk of death when you're taking a drug that is supposed to reduce your risk of having a heart attack. Now, in case you're thinking, what a relief, the agency was doing its job. These ineffective or dangerous or both drugs and devices didn't make it onto the market. That's great. Not so fast. Many serious adverse effects are not actually detected until a product is approved. So it's gone through the phase 2 and the phase 3 process. It's got its approval. It's launched onto the marketplace. Now thousands of people are taking it for much longer periods of time than you see in the phase 3 trials. And that's when a lot of these major adverse events start being picked up. So there are 2, you might say, poster children for the dangers of assuming that a drug that's passed the approval process is actually safe and effective. One is Vioxx. This is an anti-inflammatory drug, a so-called COX-2 inhibitor, prescribed for arthritis. And this was withdrawn from the market in 2004 after it was found to cause heart attacks, strokes, and death. By the way, the manufacturers of the drug, which was Merck, actually knew this. Their own data had that they hadn't released to the FDA had indicated that this was a problem, and they just buried those data. It's estimated that tens of thousands of people died as a result of taking Vioxx, and there have been major class action suits. The other example is Avandia, which was the most popular diabetes drug in the world, until it was found to have caused tens of thousands of heart attacks, strokes, and cases of heart failure. So when we're making decisions about whether to approve a drug, a vaccine, or a medical device, any kind of medical product, the FDA and all the other regulatory agencies in the world, they don't conduct their own safety tests. They actually rely on clinical trial data that are provided to them by the medical product sponsor, so the pharmaceutical company or the company that makes the device. And that's where the second article that I read this week comes in. This one was titled Reporting of Adverse Events in Published and Unpublished Studies of Healthcare Interventions, a Systematic Review. Heck of a title. So this paper delved into the differences between reporting of adverse events, commonly called side effects, of medical treatment in published versus unpublished documents. So the published documents were mostly studies that had been published in peer-reviewed medical journals, the stuff that doctors read, whereas the unpublished documents were obtained from websites, industry conferences, and also industry or medical conferences, and also industry-held data. So, for example, papers that were produced by the company that made the drug. So they included 28 studies in their analysis, and what they found was that in the case of the published studies, only 46% of them contained information on adverse events, whereas in the unpublished studies, corresponding to the same drugs or devices, 95% of these unpublished documents contain information on adverse events. And furthermore, the published documents reported lower rates of adverse events and a smaller range of side effects than the unpublished studies, which is pretty telling. The conclusions of the authors are as follows. These findings suggest that researchers should search beyond journal publications for information on side effects of treatments. And secondly, these findings also support the need for the drug industry to release full data on side effects so that a complete picture can be given to health professionals, policymakers, and patients. My conclusion is ask your doctor. Ask your doctor if he or she has gone to this much trouble to research the true risks and benefits of a drug or device before prescribing or recommending it to you. And let me know the answer to that. So looping back around again to our friend Hippocrates, when we choose to use drugs as medicine, we're buying into what's been called a reductionist way of viewing disease, which is that disease is comprised simply of biological mechanisms, pathways that can be targeted by drugs in order to affect the body's function and therefore affect a cure or at least management of the disease. So for example, there's a common type of blood pressure drug called angiotensin receptor blockers, or ARBs for short. These are drugs like Atacand, Mycardis, Avapro, and they stop a protein that the body makes, which is called angiotensin, from acting on blood vessels. As a result of interfering with angiotensin's activity, ARBs dilate the blood vessels, which lowers blood pressure. Unfortunately, and that all sounds great, like if you've got high blood pressure, sounds like a good idea to lower it. Unfortunately, though, it's not possible for a drug to produce the effects that we want it to have, the desired effect, without also producing undesired effects. And these are usually called side effects, although it's more accurate to just describe everything that a drug does as its effects. It's just that you want some of those effects and not others. In the case of ARBs, the side effects include things like a persistent cough, dizziness, headache, drowsiness, diarrhea, fatigue, indigestion, upper respiratory tract infections like colds and flu, sexual dysfunction, and in rare cases, kidney and liver failure. Now, you might be prepared to put up with the risk of all of that if these things actually made you live longer and reduce your risk of having a heart attack. But here's the kicker. ARBs actually increase the risk of heart attack when you compare them to either a placebo, an inert sugar pill. In other words, you are more likely to have a heart attack if you go on an ARB to lower your blood pressure than if you do nothing at all. And ARBs will also increase the risk of heart attack if you compare them to another type of blood pressure medication, an older type called an ACE inhibitor. So they don't stop heart attacks and they don't help people live any longer. Why on earth would you take them? So compare this reductionist approach to the approach of using food as medicine. So taking whole or minimally processed plant foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, having these as your diet. These foods contain a host of biologically active compounds, including vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, phytochemicals. And these biologically active substances interact with multiple targets in the human body to produce a host of actions that result in multiple health benefits all at the same time. And this is what Professor T. Colin Campbell, the author of the China study and also of what I think is one of the greatest books ever written called Whole, that's WHOLE. He refers to this paradigm as holism, the recognition that most chronic diseases, and maybe even many acute ones, share very similar biological pathways. And so adopting a whole food plant-based diet may result in improvement and even complete resolution of multiple health conditions at the same time. All right, so it's a holistic approach. So, for example, if you're obese and you decide you're going to treat your obesity by eating a whole food plant-based diet, you may experience some side effects like lowering your high blood pressure, reversing your type 2 diabetes, lowering your cholesterol level, reversing coronary artery disease, reducing your asthma attacks, even preventing or lowering the risk of certain types of cancer. Now, It would be untrue to say that drugs are useless. I mean, some drugs are useful in some circumstances. If I ever get bacterial meningitis, I'll take the antibiotics. Better that than die. But at the end of the day, the reductionist idea of targeting a single disease mechanism with a single drug to effect a cure without adversely affecting any other body process is just a complete fantasy. Disease doesn't work that way, and nor does health. The authors of the FDA report actually acknowledge this. Bear in mind, I mean, this is the FDA. They believe in drugs. They believe that drugs are the answer, but this is what they had to say. Many medical conditions are complex. Well, I would say they're all complex, especially chronic conditions. Targeting a single component of a condition cannot be presumed to have a positive effect on the patient unless there is objective clinical evidence. This array of unexpected results from phase 3 studies demonstrates the complexity of the interaction between a medical product and the patient, and how logical presumptions without corroborating clinical evidence can be unreliable. While biomarkers have many important uses in clinical practice and product testing, most have not been shown to reliably predict clinical outcomes. As several of these case studies illustrate, promising biomarker data in phase 2 do not necessarily translate into effective product performance. Right? In other words, you get great numbers from these drugs, but they don't actually treat your disease or keep you alive. So on the other hand, as compared to drugs, which are these foreign entities, completely foreign to the human body, that are just engineered to interfere in body processes, whole plant foods are native to the human body. We have co-evolved with these foods. That's why we're able to take compounds that plants make for their metabolism and slot them into our metabolism for beneficial effect. And when we construct our diet from these whole plant foods, we're effectively blurring the line between food, substances which provide fuel for us, and medicine, which is substances which help us to overcome disease and restore and maintain health. And when we do this, when we take this food as medicine approach, we're actually enacting another saying that's attributed to Hippocrates, and that's part of the Hippocratic oath that doctors use to swear. Make a habit of two things: to help, or at least to do no harm. To do no harm. So you really can't say that about what goes on in much of modern medicine and most of modern medicine's approach to the treatment of chronic disease. So I hope you found this thought-provoking and helpful. If you would like to see the references and actually read the reports, they are linked to in the article that accompanies this video, and the link to that is in the YouTube video that you're watching right now. If you found it useful and helpful, please like it, share it, and I will look forward to catching up with you next week.